Welcome back to Applied Behavior Analysis in Early Childhood. The title of this unit is Reinforcement of Operant Behavior. And so we began the course by defining the discriminating between behavior and environment. And then we defined learning using a pragmatic definition that's useful for predicting and controlling behavior. And we listed some basic operations and discussed the role of timing and contingencies in learning. Next, I introduce you to respondent behavior. That's behavior that's not affected by consequences in the environment, but rather entirely controlled by antecedent stimuli. And back in the 30s, in his book, The Behavior of Organisms, B.F. Skinner, a major figure in the field of behavior analysis, distinguished between respondent behavior and operant behavior. And that distinction has been maintained ever since, and it's an extremely important distinction. It has particularly important clinical implications, and so that's why in this course we focus very carefully on the distinction between respondent behavior and operant behavior. In teaching and in clinical work, in most cases, most of what you're focused on is operant behavior, but respondent behavior is important too, and especially the interaction between respondent stimuli and operant behavior. But that's for a more advanced course. So now we're focused on operant behavior for most of this course. And so operant behavior is behavior affected by consequences, and consequences have two general what we call functions, either reinforcement or punishment. And so if a consequence increases the future probability that a response will occur under similar circumstances, then we call the consequence a reinforcer. If a consequence for a behavior decreases the future probability that behavior will occur under similar circumstances, we call that consequence a punisher. In this unit, we're going to focus only on reinforcement. In the next unit, we're going to cover punishment. So let's begin with our objectives. Objective 1 is to list two major figures in the history of operant behavior. Then 2 is for you to describe basic features of Thorndike's puzzle box experiments and state its major contribution to behavior analysis. Number 3 will be for you to describe B.F. Skinner and list some of his major contributions to the field of behavior analysis. Then define operant behavior, list its defining and variable features. And then you'll discriminate between examples of respondent and operant behavior. Objective 1 lists two major figures in the history of operant behavior. The first is Edward L. Thorndike. He lived from 1874 to 1949, and Thorndike is a pioneer in the history of operant behavior and behavior analysis in that he discovered the law of effect. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. And Edward Thorndike's work was highly influential on the work of B.F. Skinner, who lived from 1904 to 1990. And really, B.F. Skinner was really at one point the most famous psychologist in the world. And it's hard to identify any figure in the history of behavior analysis with who has been more influential on the field. Essentially, B.F. Skinner is the father of behavior analysis. And so we'll talk more about both of these figures going forward here. So objective 2 is to describe basic features of Thorndike's puzzle box experiments and state its major contribution to behavior analysis. So what I'd like you to do first is go ahead and pause the video and then copy that link into your web browser and watch the brief video that summarizes Thorndike's experiments using puzzle boxes, and then we'll discuss it in more detail in the next slide. So while you're watching the video, some things to look for are the design of the box, and how the animals got out of the box, how Thorndike's measured the animals' escape from the box, how Thorndike interpreted his data, and then how Thorndike related the data to other competing theories about behavior at the time. Okay, so go ahead and pause this lecture and go ahead and watch the video, then come on back. Alright, you're back, so I'll assume you watched the video, and so let's proceed. So Thorndike conducted research concerned with animal intelligence to answer the question of how new skills were learned. And animal subjects included dogs, cats, and chicks. And the subjects were placed in a box, or boxes, and motivated to try to escape. So, a subject was placed hungry in a box. Food was placed outside the box, and a lever, loop of wire, or button called the operanda, was accessible inside the box. And if and only if, that should sound like a contingency, the subject responded to one of the operanda, in other words, they pressed a button, or pressed a lever, or pulled the loop of wire, did the box allow the animal to escape and access food. And the time it took for each subject to escape the box was repeatedly measured across trials. Now remember, that's important because learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior that results from experience that can be, and learning can be detected and assessed by repeatedly measuring some aspect of the behavior and then graphing the behavior and examining the graph data over time. And so, for example, these are data reproduced from a raw data set reported by Thorndike for a single cat in 1898. On the x-axis, trials are depicted, and latency, or the number of seconds that it took from the animal being placed in the box till the animal escaped the box, is depicted on the y-axis from 0 to 180 seconds here. And so each trial involved putting the animal in the box and waiting for the animal to escape, right? So essentially Thorndike would put the animal in the box, start a timer when the animal left the box, stop the timer, record the latency, and then plot it on the graph for a trial. So you can see it took 160 seconds in the first trial for this cat to escape the box. And the next trial was about 30 seconds. The next trial was about 90 seconds. The next trial about 60 seconds. As you can see, there's a gradual decrease in the latency to escape the box. And so a reduction in the latency to escape the box was interpreted as learning. Now, Thorndike's major contribution, published in 1905, according to Giraldo 2013, was what he called the law of effect, which said that pleasurable consequences stamp in successful acts, and failures stamp out other acts. In other words, learning is determined by consequences. So Thorndike might have said, "Hey, the lever pressing, or the button pressing, or the pulling the loop, or the loop of wire, is the response that was stamped in by escape from the box." And then other acts, such as maybe rearing in the box or sniffing the walls or corners of the box, would be stamped out because those responses didn't produce the consequence of escaping the box and getting access to the food. And Catania in 1999 wrote that some of Thorndike's writing in 1901 seemed to suggest that he believed that he discovered a fundamental learning process consisting of the selection of successful acts by consequences. And later in this unit we're going to talk about operant selection, how the events in the environment select certain variations in behavior to increase or decrease in probability in the future. And so Thorndike's results were thought to experimentally rule out the likelihood that animals learned through reasoning, comparison, and inference, as had been suggested by others. And Thorndike's discovery was highly influential on B.F. Skinner. Let's look at some ASRs. ASR 1, Thorndike measured latency to assess A, escape, B, intelligence, C, learning, or D, behavior. Give me a few more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. And the answer here is C, learning. Now, he measured escape, the latency to escape, but that wasn't to assess the escape. he certainly wasn't measuring intelligence, and he wasn't trying to assess intelligence per se. And then by measuring latency, he wasn't assessing behavior, he was measuring an aspect of behavior to assess learning, that relatively permanent change in behavior as a result of experience. ASR 2. It was important for Thorndike to make repeated measurements to assess learning because A, learning cannot occur in a single trial or instance. B, learning cannot occur without repeated measurement. C, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior over time. Or D, all of the above. Give a few more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. And the answer here is C, learning is a relatively permanent change of behavior over time. So because the change occurs over time, then you, in order to assess or detect learning, you have to repeatedly measure an aspect of the behavior over time. Now, if you chose A, learning cannot occur in a single trial or instance, that's incorrect. Learning can occur in a single trial. And if you chose learning cannot occur without repeated measurement, well, the repeated measurement isn't involved in learning. So measuring the behavior doesn't influence learning, doesn't affect learning. Learning is attributable to environmental variables, so attributable to experience, right? So we use repeated measurement to assess learning, not to produce learning. That's why B is out. So ASR 3. Now, Thorndike's major contribution to behavior analysis was the law of effect, which asserts that A, behavior affects consequences, B, learning is a reduction in latency, C, reasoning is unrelated to learning, or D, consequences determine what organisms learn. Give a few more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. And the answer here is D, consequences determine what organisms learn. Now, behavior doesn't affect consequences. Behavior has consequences, so A is out. And learning isn't a reduction in latency. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior over time as a result of experience. So, and you can assess learning by measuring any given dimensional quantity: count, rate, latency, IRT, duration. And in this case, learning was assessed by measuring latency. Okay, but that has nothing to do with the law of effect. That's just how Thorndike was studying learning. And then it says reasoning is unrelated to learning. That's really just a distractor item there. All right. Objective 3 is to describe B.F. Skinner and list some of his major contributions to behavior analysis. What I'd like you to do now is go ahead and pause the video, copy that link into your web browser, view the video on B.F. Skinner, and then come on back and we'll talk a little bit more about Skinner. Alright, you're back. I'll assume you watched the video, and let's check out the next slide here. So B.F. Skinner lived from 1904 to 1990, and so, yeah, like I said, B.F. Skinner was a famous psychologist, and he was educated at Harvard in the 30s. And he conducted experimental research, largely on rats and pigeons, starting in the 1930s. He was on the cover of Time magazine in 1971, and the title was B.F. Skinner Says We Can't Afford Freedom. And so, you know, this is an example of how B.F. Skinner was a highly controversial figure in some ways. I should probably say in many ways. And because, you know, in general, Skinner argued that there's no such thing as freedom, or there's no such thing as free will. You know, so he was disputing the idea that people have held for a long time, that the causes of behavior can be found within an individual, and that individuals are in control of their own behavior and therefore are free to make the choices that they want to make. And so B.F. Skinner said, no, that's not the case at all. That's an illusion. The environment is controlling behavior. And so But part of the reason why that was so controversial is because, well, then that brings up other issues, like, well, then should people not be held accountable for their behavior, or and so what BF's, and then if the control over behavior is in the environment, could that be used maliciously to control other people's lives in disadvantageous ways, and so forth. And so what B.F. Skinner said was, no, it's nothing like that. He said that the environment is controlling behavior, and so there's one of the great things about that is that if you can figure out how it is that the environment controls behavior, then you can arrange environments that promote optimal behavior and high quality of life, and give people a greater sense of freedom by arranging essentially antecedents and consequences in the environment that promote health and safety and well-being and caring for others and so forth. So he was a prolific scientist who published many scientific articles and books, such as The Behavior of Organisms, Schedules of Reinforcement, Science and Human Behavior, Verbal Behavior, Walden 2, just to name a few. He wrote many more books. He wrote one of the earliest books on behavior analysis in education called The Technology of Teaching. So if you're going to go into the teaching field and you're going to use applied behavior analysis, that would be a wonderful place to start in your journey of sort of learning how applied behavior analysis has been used in education, how that has changed across several decades since Skinner's text. And also Skinner was regarded as a tinkerer who built many of the apparatuses he used to conduct experiments. The apparatuses we call Skinner boxes, or operant chambers, or operant boxes. And he also invented the cumulative recorder, which we'll talk more about in this class later. Alright, here's one more video of Skinner that summarizes his work. Go ahead and pause the video, copy that link into your browser, watch the video, and then come on back. Alright, you're back. Let's proceed. Okay, so now we're going to focus on Skinner's major contributions. And there are many, many, many contributions that Skinner made to the field of behavior analysis. So, we're just going to list a few here. And we're going to start with contribution number 1, that he discovered principles of operant behavior. And we're going to be talking about principles of operant behavior throughout this course. That's really what this course is mostly about. So principles include reinforcement, punishment, stimulus generalization, stimulus discrimination, response differentiation, motivating operation. We're going to talk about all this stuff going forward, but I just listed a few principles for you. Another way you can think about principle of operant behavior is you can think about principle as being synonymous with natural law. So he discovered the natural laws that govern operant behavior. He pioneered the experimental analysis of behavior, also known as EAB. That's considered one of the major domains in behavior analysis. You can break behavior analysis up into EAB, and then applied behavior analysis research, applied behavior analysis practice or service delivery, and then the conceptual analysis of behavior. We'll talk about those towards the tail end of this course. But for now, just know that he pioneered the experimental analysis of behavior, and the purpose of the experimental analysis of behavior was to identify and characterize those fundamental principles or natural laws governing operant behavior. Number 3, he developed the philosophy of radical behaviorism. Radical behaviorism is a type of behaviorism, and behaviorism is the philosophy underlying the science of behavior analysis. He extended the analysis of behavior to verbal behavior. All right. And that's a critical feature of radical behaviorism, is the extension of analysis behavior to verbal behavior. So Skinner thought, his initial experiments in which he discovered the principles of operant behavior were conducted with rats and pigeons. And so later in his career, Skinner inferred that through his radical behaviorism and a conceptual analysis of behavior, he reinterpreted language and cognition by putting it within the framework of behavior analysis and applying principles of operant behavior to interpret language and cognition as behavior, and specifically verbal behavior. And basically, what Skinner thought is that there was nothing special about verbal behavior per se, that's just behavior, and behavior is controlled by the environment, and there are fundamental principles of operant behavior that apply to both verbal and nonverbal behavior, or the behavior of non-human organisms and the behavior of humans. Basically said there are no special properties or principles related to verbal behavior. The advantage of that is you can use the fundamental principles of behavior discovered in EAB to develop technology that you can use to teach verbal behavior. Okay, so in number 5 here, his early work ultimately led to the field of applied behavior analysis. All right, so Skinner wasn't like a founder of applied behavior analysis. There are other folks who picked up Skinner's work and then applied it in humans, but Skinner himself, his work, did not, he wasn't a founder of applied behavior analysis. He founded experimental analysis of behavior, but ultimately that work led to the field of applied behavior analysis. And I'm also going to summarize for you Skinner's experimental methodology. So in the experiments that Skinner conducted, he focused on the behavior of an individual rather than the group. And that's important because he conceptualized behavior as, something that only a single living organism can do. Right? And then he used repeated measurement of behavior over time, similar to Thorndike. He relied on experimental control to understand relations between behavior and environment. He used the visual analysis of graphically depicted behavior to determine experimental effects. And he relied on induction. Induction is a type of scientific reasoning that consists of using a series of specific observations to then form more general knowledge, that is, to arrive at principles of behavior. And so those are some aspects of Skinner's experimental methodology as summarized by Tinkani and Travers in 2017. So let's look at some ASRs now. ASR 4. Which of the following was not a major contribution of B.F. Skinner? A, the concept of the operant. B, experimental analysis of behavior. C, respondent conditioning. Or D, radical behaviorism. Give you a few seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. And the answer here is C, respondent conditioning. Okay, that wraps up video part 1, and I'll see you in video part 2, beginning with objective 4.